Welcome to the More Than a Worship Leader podcast. I'm your host, Gary Durbin. I've been a worship leader for over 20 years, and I've learned a lot from so many on this journey. On this podcast, we'll have conversations and explore the dynamics of leading worship in the local church. Hey everyone, and welcome to a bonus episode of the More Than a Worship Leader podcast. I thought it might be a good idea for those who don't know me to do a get to know me episode. So I thought, who better than my lovely wife, Jenny, to come and interview me and ask me some questions. So welcome to the podcast, Jenny.
Hey, y'all.
So Jenny, I'm going to let you take it from here, but she's just going to ask me some questions so I can kind of tell my story and just let those of you who have graciously started listening to this podcast get to know me a little better.
All righty. Well, I've known you for quite a long time, obviously, and I know about your upbringing in ministry and all the places you've lived and been. And it's all very interesting. So tell us a little bit about your upbringing and ministry.
Well, I was brought up in ministry my whole life. My dad was a music minister in the local church. We were in churches all over the country. In the Midwest is where I was born. We were in Florida for a while, and even in California. So definitely grew up in the church, Sunday morning, Sunday afternoon choir practice, Sunday night church, Monday night visitation, Wednesday night church. So I was always at the church, and I'm grateful for that. There's good memories, and I'm grateful to have grown up in a Christian home where they made church a priority. And I'm also grateful that I grew up as a ministry kid. I know that's not always a great thing for everyone who grows up in ministry, but my parents were awesome as ministers and as ministry people, and they definitely made time for me and my brother, and we just had a really good upbringing, and I'm grateful for that. And as I got older in my teen years, started getting into music, learned how to play guitar, started feeling God calling me towards ministry, specifically music. And then the worship movement started in the 90s, and that really grabbed my heart. It was just a perfect fit for who I was and where my passions were. The idea of leading worship instead of just like singing songs, even though there's a place for that to encourage people, to minister to people. But man, my passion really was quickly found in the idea of leading others in songs to the Lord. So I really chased that. I'm a college dropout. I did go to college for a little bit, but I don't think I was in the right mental or heart space at the time, and ended up dropping out. But I kept pursuing this idea of worship ministry as I worked jobs. And eventually, in the early 2000s, an amazing pastor in Illinois gave me my first chance. He was looking for a worship leader like myself to come in and change the culture and the style of worship in his church. I ended up being with him in Illinois and another church in Florida for about a decade. And I'm still really close with him. And then after that, season was over, I went to a church plant in Denver, Colorado for a few years. And then after that, I ended up here in Ohio at Redemption Chapel. I've been here for about 6.5 years, and it's really been an amazing church and ministry to be a part of. I'm grateful for it, especially the last couple of years. I've been through a lot of challenging things, but I'm grateful for the church I'm in now, the ministry I lead. It's just an exciting season of life.
We were definitely raised very similar in our upbringing. And like I mentioned earlier, I've known you for quite a long time. And well, we've both been through divorce, and now we're remarried February this year. So why don't you share your journey through all of that?
So I was married at an early age of 21, and then soon after that is when I got into ministry. So I've been in ministry for about 20 years, And my first marriage was about 20 years. In that time, we had two amazing kids, Josh, who was born in 2004, and Jade, who was born in 2008. And unfortunately, we went through a season that a lot of people go through, and that's a season of divorce. It started in 2019 with some challenges, and then in 2020, during the pandemic, everything came to light that, that the marriage was coming to an end, and had to go through that time of separation and divorce. Fortunately, I was in a church that handled it very well. As the main worship leader, they looked at it from a biblical point of view. The elders got involved and to make sure that, I was in the right place, that I was still qualified and able to keep my position. So I'm grateful that they kept me on. And so that was a crazy season of heartache and tragedy, trauma. I went through some really intense counseling coming out of that. Had a lot of support from friends and family. And I really went through a season of just falling in love with Jesus on a deeper level than I'd ever have before. And I never want to leave that space because Jesus was so intimate for me during that time when I felt very lonely. Being a single guy, a worship leader in a church. But it was also, I look back and it was a very special time. And that singleness ended this past year. In 2021, you and I reconnected, and we go way back to one of the churches I grew up in Kansas. And Jenny and I was just little kids in the church running around. And then 30 years later, we reconnected. We both went through divorce in our first marriages, and God has graciously reunited us. And we just got married in February of 2022 and just loving life, doing ministry together.
Well, I am definitely glad our journeys led to each other, and I am very proud of you for all you've walked through and all you have and are accomplishing. So you have written 2 books, which are on Amazon now, and your first one you wrote several years ago. And talk about that and the reason you wrote that book.
Well, my first book is called More Than a Worship Leader, which is the precursor to this podcast. Several years ago, I had this idea of more than a worship leader. And it started with a blog post. And as a writer, I'd written blogs for years. As a writer, I always dreamed of writing a book. Didn't know what to write a book about. And then finally, the idea hit me of more than a worship leader. Because I think with worship ministry and the worship boom, if you will, happening, I think the idea of ministering to people has gotten a little foggy. I think too often we look at the worship leader position as the person that's just bringing it from the stage, and that's it. It's like they are in front of people, and that's the most important thing, instead of being in the lives of people. So that led me to write this book, More Than a Worship Leader, where I really lay out the idea of basically loving people. Because, Jesus gave us those 2 commandments in Matthew 22. Just love people, love God, love people. And as worship leaders, we're called to do that. And we can do that on stage. We can do that off stage. And also in my book, I talk about the idea of being upstaged, the idea of, training someone up to take your spot. Basically not finding too much identity in the title worship leader, but being more than that, being a follower of Jesus and being someone that loves people. So I took a couple of years and wrote that book and released it in 2017. Amazingly, it sold very well, and it is on Amazon now. There's been a lot of worship leaders that have picked it up. And I've even seen worship leaders get them in bulk because it has like discussion questions at the end of each chapter. So it's been really cool to see that book take off.
Very cool. That leads me to my next question about your second book that you recently released this year. So tell us the story behind that book.
So like I said, the first book seemed to be selling at bulk at times. And I remember thinking, I think these worship leaders are buying them for their teams, but the book isn't actually for worship teams, it's for worship leaders. So then comes COVID, 2020, all the challenges that came with that. Found myself at home a lot. And I thought, you know what? I could probably write a book for worship teams. And I came up with the idea of More Than a Band. So that's what I did. I sat down and wrote a discussion book for worship teams to go through, even with the tech team and the players and the singers on stage in mind. This goes way back to, 15 to 20 years ago when I first got in ministry. I remember going online and trying to find a book like this, something that will bring up discussions and conversations and get to the heart of why we do what we do, but is not a long read. Just a simple devotional book that we could take some time in rehearsal, but not take like an hour to go over it or have a bunch of homework. I just wanted some kind of resource, and I had a really hard time finding that back then. And so that came to mind as I was sitting down to write it. And I was like, well, I'm just going to write exactly what I was looking for back then. So that's what I did. It's called More Than a Band. It's got 9 chapters, and each chapter has 3 sections in it called the team, the church, and the word. And then it has a major application at the end of each chapter. Now, what we've done with our team, because we have a very large rotation on our worship team, we've actually taken a chapter a month. So it'll probably take us like 9 months to go through the book. But we're going through it right now. It seems to be very successful in helping us really get at the heart of why we do what we do. But it's called More Than a Band.
Yeah, I would agree. It's definitely unified our worship team. They seem to be very engaged each week that we go through it together. So I think that's really amazing and awesome. I've never done that before with any other worship team. So it's really cool to be a part of that with our team. And now, obviously, you have a podcast all about these things. What brought you to do a podcast, and what are you hoping to accomplish with this?
Well, I think the first thing that brought me to do a podcast was similar to a book. Like I always dreamed of writing a book. And it's as simple as that with a podcast. I knew at some point I'd love to do a podcast just because it's fun. I'm a media guy. I do a lot of video and graphic design on the side as well with my job at the church. So I was like, man, I think that would be really fun as I listen to podcasts and think about interviewing people, recording that, and then just the editing process, just all the creative juices were flowing for me. And so, yeah, not long after I wrote More Than a Band in 2020, again, I was home. I was sitting there thinking, man, if I did a podcast, I wonder if I could do one on more than a worship leader. And then it hit me like all these worship leaders that I know around the country that exemplify the idea of more than a worship leader. How fun would that be? So I just started texting people, just putting feelers out there, and everybody was like, yeah, sure, no problem. And so a lot's happened the last couple of years. I've been very busy, but this last summer I was like, I need to finally do this. I need to launch this. And so I've committed a year to do it. I'm putting out 1 episode a month. We'll see how it goes, but I'm having a blast with it. And my whole heart behind it is just to interview these worship leaders. Some of them I know very well that have impacted me in different ways, and just let them share their heart, let them share their wisdom, and hopefully worship leaders and church leaders who listen to this will grow and learn some things from it, just as I've learned from these people.
On this podcast, you always ask your guests this next question. What is the craziest or most embarrassing moment you've had on stage?
All right. It is my turn to answer this question. Well, I can think of a couple moments. There was one where I was leading worship and having one of those like really powerful moments where the music was really down and I had my hands stretched out, had my guitar on, but my hands were stretched out. And all of a sudden my strap breaks on the guitar and it just pounded. It was almost like I took the guitar and just like almost like taking an axe and chopping wood, you know. It's almost like just hammered on the stage, and of course it's plugged in, so it just reverberates through the sound system, and it was just brutal, and everybody's just like, oh. And I think everybody in the room's thinking the same thing. I hope his guitar is okay, you know. It sounded so bad. I remember just going, okay, well, there's no recovering from that moment, so let me let me put my guitar back on, and they all laughed, and you move on. And then I remember another one was, you know, you're plugged into these personal mixers. It was an Aviom, and you've got the cord plugged in. It's not cordless. I'm plugged in by a cord. And I remember during one of the songs, my guitarist was playing the wrong part, or he started too soon or something like that. And I like rushed over to tell him not to play. And as I did that and I came back, the cord latched itself on another personal mixer. And as I'm going to the microphone, it just like yanks it over, and it was just crazy. It was bull in a china shop kind of moment. But yeah, those are embarrassing moments. Those are the moments that keep us humble. Those are the moments that help us go, okay, we don't have to take ourselves too seriously. So yeah, not my proudest moments.
Well, we are obviously at a church here in Ohio, so why don't you talk about the ministry and church we are in right now?
Well, so like I said, I've been at this church for about 6.5 years. It's called Redemption Chapel. And I remember looking for a new church 6.5 years ago and talking to the pastor. His name's Rick McKee, and just realizing, man, I think we're going to work well together. So that has come to be true. And I've been here for 6.5 years as the worship arts director. That role has changed slightly as our church has grown. When I first got here, I was doing a lot of things. I was doing, of course, the music side of things, graphic design, video, website, social media, IT, all those things with the assistance of some part-time and volunteer staff. And now as our church has grown, we've been blessed enough to hire some great help with the tech director. His name's TJ. And I just hired a worship leader, Anya, who's come alongside of me to lead our worship ministry. So I'm super excited about the season we're in now. And it's freed me up to focus on some other things such as divorce care. Jenny and I launched divorce care this last fall at our church. We're so excited about that. We're not excited. We always say we're not excited about people getting divorced, but we are excited about people who need this ministry, who are coming in and getting the help and healing that they need. So it's been fun to start that. And like I said, it's called Redemption Chapel here in Stowe, Ohio. It's just a great ministry and it's a great church that loves to worship, that loves to grow and be in the Word of God, and also reach out to our community with the life-changing gospel of Jesus. So very, very grateful for this season and this church that we're in right now.
Well, thank you for having me on your podcast. I'm really excited to see how it impacts other worship leaders and their ministries.
Well, thank you, Jenny, for being on the podcast and for being my wife. And we are just loving life and loving ministry together. And Jenny and I also are songwriters. So in the show notes, I'll put some links to our music and also some links to the books. More Than a Worship Leader, More Than a Band. Thank you for supporting me and checking those out. Thank you for sharing them. And thank you so much for listening to this podcast. We've got some great interviews coming up for the new year, for 2023. I'm really excited about that. So make sure you add this to your podcast playlist and stay tuned for some great episodes coming soon. Stay tuned for the next episode of the More Than a Worship Leader podcast. I'd greatly appreciate you subscribing and sharing. Thanks for listening.